I wanted to talk about Elizabeth Bishop explicitly because when I was doing the Dream Songs, right, this was all in this kind of Dream Songs orbit. John Barrowman is known as something called a confessional poet, right? So we have this like movement in American poetry, which Barrowman is a part of, that is like, talking about personal relationships, your kind of like personal self in a way that it's kind of, I guess, could even be like very harsh about that kind of inner reality. And this kind of became pretty fashionable. I'd say like, I'm not sure if Sylvia Plath is technically like fully in that category, but I would definitely put her personally in that category. I would put Elizabeth Bishop in that category. So there's this villanelle by Bishop that I don't know if this is her most famous poem, but this to me is the poem that I remember her most for. Maybe it's my favorite poem of hers, although in some ways it's an imperfect poem as well. So here we have the title, right? Before I even give you the analysis, right? Perhaps we should just read it first, and I'll give you the analysis second. And of course, if you want to analyze it for yourself first, if you've never seen this poem before, you could always pause the stream and then unpause it. It's going to continue exactly where you left off, not where I left off, if you want to do that. So let's just read it first. For those that are hearing this and not watching it, it's called One Art by Elizabeth Bishop. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster. So the first thing I would say is, I always like look at the titles first, right? Dan has always made this point in his essays that when it comes to putting titles on works of art, it's almost always preferable to actually have a title, right, than to just do this like untitled bullshit, which is just kind of, it amounts to something pretty lazy. Perhaps you could have a series of poems that makes sense where, the poems individually are entitled. Maybe even the whole thing could be entitled, but that usually cannot be like the bulk of your creations, right? Or it shouldn't be, right? Because you're sort of leaving a lot on the table. And the reason why is, everybody expects some kind of title. And because it's expected, that space automatically is allotted to you, right? There is no sense that, okay, if I don't put a title on, it's perfectly fine, it's valid, because I'm not wasting space, right? You are, just by sheer like inertia, right, over time, right, the inertia of culture and tradition, you are given a freebie, right? You're essentially always given this line, at the top of every poem that you could turn into a title, right? And nobody's going to think any less of you for doing so. In fact, if you have really great titles, you will come out on top for that reason. So, she, decided to title it One Art, which, knowing the content of the poem, it's a good serviceable title, right? We don't expect, for example, that the one art that she's going to be talking about is going to be the art of losing something, losing things. It's a nice, interesting way of phrasing, I guess an unfortunate part of day-to-day reality, an unfortunate part of, and kind of like a defining feature of, long term, you accumulate tons of losses in life, right? People that die, relationships that end, money that you had or didn't have or whatever, like, as a part of as a feature of everyday life, right? So, it's a good serviceable title for that reason. We have an expectation that is going to be thwarted by the title alone. The fact that it's like, short and pithy. I mean, it just kind of like sticks with you. It kind of recaps much of what this is about. At the same time, though, although it's good and serviceable, I mean, it's not like a great title, right? It doesn't really offer a new layer of meaning like, some of the best titles might. It doesn't, like for example, like if you, even if something like on first looking into Chapman's Homer, the great sonnet by, John Keats, that title is just kind of like a de facto first line, and you wouldn't truly know what he's talking about, and you wouldn't be like truly set in that kind of position where for the first time, like just imagine someone opening up this book and what this would have done. Just as a kind of bit of trivia, for those that haven't read it, Chapman's Homer is like this, like I think it's 10 or 12 syllable couplets, which is really weird for any kind of classical Greek poetry. I mean, like just think about it. Like if classical poetry rarely rhymed, and suddenly you have these couplets that are just so out of place in terms of the sound, the feeling, the tones that it creates. Like anyway, I don't want to get too off base, but the point is that titles can do a lot. This does something, but it doesn't do as much as we would necessarily want it to do, as much as it could do, or as it perhaps should do. So that's the first part. So let's just take this line by line and analyze it as we go. The art of losing isn't hard to master, right? Another, like, a good line that, it's not, it's just unexpected, right? Calling it the art of losing, saying that it isn't hard to master. We're setting up this like understatement that kind of comes again and again and again. And ultimately, right, the reason we would set up this understatement is we want to show exactly why this understatement fails, right? Why psychologically somebody might wish to phrase things in an understatement and what's actually going on in the mind, right? Very similar to Edna St. Vincent Millay. Yeah, she has a sonnet. It's a great sonnet. I don't think it even has a title, right? The title is just the first line. If I should, in some quite casual way. And she's basically just kind of like imagining herself sitting down. And as she's sitting down, she's like reading like a newspaper, like in a train or something. And she's like slowly and elaborately like building up the scenario where ultimately the thing that she's reading about is the death of, like, it sounds like a lover or something. And in fact, like by the end of the poem, you realize that this wasn't just a hypothetical that she created. This is what she actually described, which she saw herself happening. And you see how these understatements, these hypotheticals really build up and really play nicely with the psychological tension. And Elizabeth Bishop does the same thing here, right? We are building up this kind of psychological tension, even like from the first line, from the title. Which is why I don't want to be too critical about things like the title, right? I mean, this works. This is a really nice poem. So the art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost, that their loss is no disaster, right? That's also a nice little inversion, right? So many things seem filled with the intent, right? Like it's as if these objects, it's almost like this fucking game that's being played with you, right? That you're trying to escape loss, and yet everything just wants to escape you. But also, like, in some ways, like some of them kind of like technical problems, I guess, with the poem. This stanza sets it up for us as well. You'll see what I mean. Lose something every day. Accept the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master, right? So far, right, we're getting a sense of what, a villanelle is, right? We look at the rhyme scheme, we look at the repetition, we start thinking, well, of all the kinds of, poetic forms that you could take upon yourself to write from, why would you choose a villanelle? Well, if you want this kind of repetition that just naturally lends itself to I guess this kind of like, it's even if you're not rhyming, right? Like it just feels like what a rhyme feels like, right? Technically, I guess you could do some kind of villanelle without even rhyming, right? You could have just a bunch of repetition that kind of functions a little bit like a villanelle in the same way that you could have a sonnet, right? That's like maybe 14 and a half or 15 lines where you sort of play with that octet and that sestet in kind of novel ways. And, instead of making the octet 8, you sort of give it the same feeling, but, you maybe give it 9 lines and you kind of broaden it out. There's a reason usually why we want 14 lines. Like most of these kinds of experiments, they haven't been that good historically. But the point is like you could do that, right? And villanelles just... even before you get to the rhyme, like that repetition, it gives you that kind of, dreamlike quality. And if you have a good line that you could repeat again and again and again, right? Which this is, right? The art of losing isn't hard to master. You repeat variations of that, like it kind of sticks in the head, right? This is why, like, I can't really think that many poems off the top of my head from Bishop, but this one does like stick with me, right? Then practice losing farther, losing faster. Places and names and where it was you meant to travel. None of these will bring disaster. So this then practice losing farther, losing faster, right? We're going from, the first 2 stanzas are just like a set of understatements, right? We have these understatements, and ultimately here we have this kind of fulcrum, and a lot of villanelles sort of do that. We go from something that sounds like something else. And we have a fulcrum that creates a turn in this poem, right? Which this poem absolutely does need. Practice losing farther, losing faster, right? This losing farther, right? I mean, like in a purely like logical way, right? It doesn't seem to make sense, but we understand exactly what she means, right? Like it's a deeper kind of loss in some way. You have to practice it because this is gonna come, right? And the idea that she calls it practice. Like I've always found that very intriguing, right? That this is just kind of like a dress rehearsal, maybe for life, because essentially every time that you're doing this, like you're almost like building yourself up to respond to like maybe like some ultimate set of losses, like something that is truly damaging and shocking, like the death of a spouse or a parent or a child or so some real change in your life situation of some other sort. So it's an intriguing choice, right? To call this a practice. Kind of reminds me a little bit of, when I think of like exercising, I try not to think of it as, a set of things to, like a set of like end goals, right? You just think of it as practice, right? You're always just sort of finessing yourself a little bit, right? It makes it more fun. It makes you prepared for anything that might come to you. And also you don't take it that serious, and you don't allow something like exercise to control you or kill you, right? Same thing here. You don't want to have loss kill you, right? She says it all the time, right? Not all these things are a disaster. But this last sentence in the stanza, though, it's always like stuck out with me as kind of a throwaway. And this is where like I guess some of the problems begin. It's something like a villanelle, which is like so dependent on this kind of repetition. You have to make sure that each variation of disaster, right? In this case, it would be, disaster, master, over and over again. You have to make sure that these are fresh variations, right? When Joel and I in Artifact, number 6, when we did art and physics, when we got to, Hakusai's prints, every time that he had this repetition, right, of clouds, like every print has had some kind of either cloud cover or clouds visibly that were kind of, sketched out actually, right? In the way that you could say, like, this is the shape of a cloud. Like, every time that he did that, he found new variations, right? Because he knew, like, okay, if we're going to have 36 views of Mount Fuji, we can't make them the same fucking shit, right? So, and those individual elements can't be the same thing over and over again. We need clever ways to invert the ways that we see clouds. Same thing here. We need clever ways of inverting how disaster and master and how these words are used. none of these will bring disaster is very kind of, it's very kind of like meh and throw away, right? It's almost as if like she was seeking to find something to rhyme with. She was seeking a play on this set of themes that she's already cultivated, and this here was the best that you could come up with. And to me, it's like a little bit annoying, especially since this fulcrum is so effective, right? Practice losing farther, losing faster, going from understatement to like, wow, we're gonna make this a little bit darker. So this has always been like a little bit of a like a little annoying point to me. So then, she goes into the specifics, right? I lost my mother's watch, and look, my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. This is better, right? There's nothing really throwaway here. I especially enjoy this kind of feminine rhyme, right? When you think of a feminine rhyme, it's going to be 2 syllables, right? Where you have the stress in the first syllable, and then the second syllable is going to be the rhyming syllable. And sometimes that's used in like kind of like, I guess, funny or humorous poetry, sardonic poetry. But here it's kind of used almost as a kind of like little corruption of that. It kind of, sticks with you. My last or next to last, right? It's just a little clever way of doing that and using, feminine rhymes in a little, different way, I guess. And this, like, of 3 loved houses went, this loved, it's just enough description that it sets the pace of her kind of emotional response, and there's no fluidity here. It's just kind of just flat out. This is how it feels, and that's good. You don't want to overdo it too much here. You don't have that many lines to work with in a villanelle, and the variations really limit you in terms of like the wiggle room that you do have. So I mean that's a good choice. But then you get kind of like some of the same problems, right? So I said that the 3 loved houses went. It's nice. It's just like one adjective, and it just kind of gets out of the way to get back to this like effective repetition. But here you have I lost 2 cities, lovely ones. I mean, this is just like a padding out of syllables, right? This is not. You have really not much else to say, so you might say this. And the fact that it's kind of like close to loved here, we have like, a similar kind of adjective. It's good that, she's technically strong enough to understand that, this, the repetition that we already have, let's make this repetition also, in like a kind of, riff on something earlier. So we're going to change from love to lovely. Right. I remember one time when I was writing a sonnet, I had a sonnet that it was like about like a dying cat, and I used like Schrodinger's, like it was called Schrodinger's alteration. And, I ended it by saying something like, it is death, it is living, I cannot know. Like it was like something like that. And Dan said, hey, it's actually good that you knew enough to say, it is death, it is living, and not say something like, it is death, it is life, right? You don't want too much of this kind of analogous shit going on where, the antonym of death is life. You don't really want too much of that in poetry, right? There's places for it. There's places for this kind of repetition, but, especially when so much other repetition is going on, you just don't want to like, go full hog and individual words repeating, right? Because it's going to sound kind of flat. It's going to sound kind of, silly, like you don't really have much else to say. So, a little bit of a throwaway here. So I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster. Some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster. And going back here, like I said, this was a nice touch, right? Then practice losing farther, losing faster, this like fulcrum where it gets a little more serious. And here you have a similar kind of idea, right? And vaster, right? Again, we're going back to like, let's talk about more profound losses. Some realms I owned, right? Like, what does that mean? Right. It's not countries, most likely, but, realms is kind of, a kind of nod to, conceptions of like realms or whatever in the past. this could mean, something more physical. This could mean kind of like, maybe she felt her talents were greater, at some other point in her life. Maybe the realm that she's referring to is just kind of, a life situation just completely changed. You don't have to like the point is you don't have to pigeonhole yourself into an answer. It's perfectly valid to have multiple answers here. And in fact, for some of the best poetry, and this is like, this is one of the best villanelles, published, right? Anyway, like you don't have to like just settle on a single answer, right? And vast are some realms I owned, 2 rivers, a continent, right? So back to the kind of like, if you don't want to see this in a purely physical light, right? Here, we're back to the kind of, just positioning herself in physical space and, maybe where she used to live, what she used to have in that sense, right? This kind of like material sort of thing that is a nice contrast to this more abstract part here. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Very kind of like, I guess this kind of understatement is still necessary for what comes in the final stanza, right? Which in a villanelle almost always is like 4 lines for a final stanza. But I mean, again, it's kind of I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. I miss them. Like it's needlessly prosaic. I don't think that adds all that much. This is again kind of like, paint by numbers. I need to do something with the word disaster, and this is what I have. So, a little bit weak, right? And these are like all the details that I just listed. A truly great villanelle is not going to give you, so many avenues for a negative critique. Not that like even in great poetry, I'm sure you could have like some avenues for a negative critique, but first of all, it's going to be much harder to find avenues for a negative critique. And also, to the extent that you could have a negative critique of a great poem, that negative critique, like that, those things that you call negative, they're so like fucking baked into the greatness of the poem itself that it's very possible that if you were to eliminate some of those elements that you think are flawed, the whole thing might get disrupted. And there's plenty of examples of that being the case. Like if you just think of like so many great poems that maybe you have a kind of like a negative personal response to in some way, just like go back and really like ask yourself like, okay, so I have this like visceral response that I want to get to the bottom of. Would making the changes that I really want to make do what I think it's actually going to do? And the bottom line should always be like, how are we going to improve this poem? Because everything else is bullshit. Everything else is just your personal vanity. It's like, you're writing a book and you're like, oh, but I want to be absolutely honest about myself. I want to be absolutely honest about X, Y, Z. Well, that's all well and good, but without the bottom line, which is like, making something worthwhile, making something excellent or great, or even making it grander than that, that's important. Okay, so let's just read the stanza again and then the last one. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I own, 2 rivers, a continent. I miss them, but it wasn't a disaster. Even losing you, the joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like write it like disaster. So, I mean, it's a clever ending, right? On the one hand, like, I guess it's kind of trite in the sense that, like, okay, we're ultimately gonna fucking end on some kind of, personal relationship, which is kind of like always like the apex of loss, right? If you're kind of like a like a well-tuned human being, I guess, to you, like the harshest losses in your life are going to be, people that you lose. And, it's not just automatically 100% clear that she's talking about a romantic relationship. You can, of course, surmise that, knowing that, this is a woman, or at least a woman writer, who knows exactly who the narrator is. perhaps talking about a man, but this could be, like a sibling rivalry where, she cut out her sister from her life or something. This could be a couple different things, but I've always interpreted this in a kind of, romantic sense, because it's just what makes the most sense to me. But again, like the fact that the apex loss is the one that you sort of expect, and this is where you get, this is, that part is a little bit annoying, but, to the extent that it's like a little melodramatic, well, is it more of a kind of, soap opera melodrama, or is it the melodrama of a Shakespeare who, has melodrama used for deeper and more clever and better purposes, right? And here, I mean, the structuring is kind of clever, right? The art of losing is not too hard to master, though it may look like write it like disaster, right? This is the first time that there's this kind of admission, right? There's this kind of like interruption of the self. We're going to say write it like disaster. So, these are my comments on Elizabeth Bishop. Let me see if we have anything going on. Sorry, guys, just give me a second. All right. So the next poem that I'm going to talk about is also a villanelle, and because it's a villanelle, right, we could have a kind of more apt set of comparisons. And this is a villanelle from Jessica Schneider. She wrote Moth Lost in a Laboratory when she was, I believe, in her early to mid 20s. I mean, it's a great villanelle. Like it is the best villanelle that I can think of off the top of my head, even if there's, a bunch of others that are good or that I like perhaps more subjectively. Anyway, so Moth Lost in a Laboratory. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. Swarmed such creatures' willful sounded plight freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. Do the eyes not soften upon the tile, among the whimsical gesture-sifted flight? A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. Aside a wall, tilted wings, brazen, wild, nearing investigation a severed sight, freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. Toward the cosmos, artificial light files between airs shifting flee into flight. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. In landing, where the dish room is docile, it commands dashing spans of whispered height, freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. Textured wings, swift in horizontal style, cross-tethered interiors of light. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles, freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. So like already, like kind of like right off the bat, just as a kind of, basis for comparison, we have one art versus Moth Lost in a Laboratory. I would argue that this is, as a title, it's more necessary than one art. Right, because one art kind of it puts you into this position. It gives you something to subvert. But this could have been, titled something else, and it would have been, almost just as serviceable. But if you take away this title, right, Moth Lost in a Laboratory, first of all, you do get this like, the moth appearing again and again, but you don't exactly know what's going on. Like this is necessary for repositioning, right? Because Jessica says that I'm not going to waste any fucking time, like talking about, in any kind of prosaic way, the context and the surroundings, of this moth. I'm going to have to give the reader that immediately, right? And once we can all determine that this is a moth lost in a laboratory, which is what the title is, we could move past that point and just see exactly, what that laboratory looks like without the word laboratory being used. I mean, like just think about it. This would be to use laboratory in a villanelle. I mean, you can, but in the context of this poem, probably it would be kind of clunky. It's best to get the clunk out of the way. All right, so. Instinctively, she must have understood that. And then also, like, to the question of, like, what exactly is being repeated, do you have a phrase that really sticks with you? And you have a few. I mean, a beauty circumvents that which beguiles. And then you have variations of freeze into moth, substance of the spiral, right? A lot more sort of abstract here, a lot less like you could, pin this down on something specific. Here it's kind of like more, I guess, more base, right? And I think both of these are kind of like equally good, right? The art of losing isn't hard to master. It's an understatement that we know immediately, like what this is about, where this is going, but it's effectively written. So it doesn't really matter all that much that we could sort of apprehend much of it right away. But the other variations of, the loss is no disaster. None of these would bring disaster. But it wasn't a disaster because we had so many kind of like forced lines and forced rhymes in that sense. Here we don't have that, right? Because here you could keep saying freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. Because it's it itself, right? The word beguiling, the interesting part about the poem is the word beguiling is how it starts, right? But it aptly describes, the entire poem, especially also, the third line, right? Freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. I mean, what exactly, does that refer to? And there's like a few things knowing that this is a lab. But it's beguiling enough, it's mysterious enough that sticks in your head. Also the line, a beauty circumvents that which beguiles. Like, you immediately have to start thinking about the different ways that you could define some of these terms. So a beauty circumvents. Okay, so what does circumvent mean? Circumvent means to, find a way to kind of like get around something without having to go through it, right? It could be, circumventing in an abstract sense, like an argument or whatever. It could be circumventing like a physical space, but circumvent has other meanings, right? Sometimes like it's used to mean like to put an end to something, to put a stop to something. A beauty stops, right? That which beguiles, right? Maybe you could say that beauty, in some ways, like it gives you this feeling of like, like anything that's beautiful has like a halo effect, right? Whether it's like, men and women that look beautiful, right? Sometimes you would have this sense of like, oh, they must be good people, right? Or beautiful, men and women and tall men and beautiful women, they get higher, for example, pay, right? According to studies. So we know that beauty has like some effects that are not altogether positive. Same thing with, I'm going to do an essay on this in a couple of months, on beauty by this guy, Roger Scruton, he died last year. He was a conservative, or maybe actually he died early this year, was it? I don't really remember. He died recently. He has his book on beauty, right? And I see this conflation all the time, like beauty with art. And they're just such different quantities and they're just such different qualities. And it doesn't make sense all the time to discuss them in a way that just conflates them. So, this is one possibility, right? Like we talked about a lot of possibilities here, which, here, we don't really get to all that much because it's a little bit more prosaic. And definitely here, right? We can talk about even less in Elizabeth Bishop's like second set of repetitions. But here with Jessica's second set of repetitions, freeze into moth, substance of the spiral, these two lines really kind of go hand in hand, right? And back to circumvent, right? A beauty circumvents that. A beauty goes around that which beguiles, right? A beauty helps you see past, the mystery. It might help you see past, the kind of like ruse in some ways, right? So, and again, we don't have to get too specific. We have enough like individual pieces of meaning that we could just discuss those, and that's perfectly fine. And just like I want to talk about the first stanza in terms of like just how it sounds and the kind of insistent fucking like rhythmical force that it has. I'm not sure if everybody picked up on that, so let's just read that first stanza again. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. Swarmed such creatures' willful sounded plight freeze into moth, substance of the spiral. Right? It's hard to sort of say it in one breath, right? We have this strong stress, swarmed, comma, right? hard pause. Such creatures willful sounded plight, right? Willful sounded plight. Again, there's any number of ways that you can interpret this, and all of them just sound nice. All of them present new layers of meaning for the rest of the poem. Willful sounded plight freeze into moth. All right, plight. What are we, talking about here, right? It could be a moth lost that's sort of, flying around. There might be in this lab also, I mean, who knows? Like there could have been, moth specimens that were taken in and, killed and dried for whatever, purposes. One of them could actually be alive. Maybe that's why it's lost. Like it shouldn't be, it's in a dangerous kind of territory. What is the nature of its plight? Is it merely that the window was open and a moth kind of flew in? Or, is it something else, right? We get like a fulcrum here, right? With one art. Practice losing farther, losing faster. You already get like a little bit of something like perhaps maybe a little bit sinister, right, with this word early on, right? But it's just kind of a hint. It's just one word. It doesn't have to be like the most sinister interpretation available, right? This moth might not be in danger at all, but the fact that this interpretation is available to us based on the evidence in the text, that's important to have. Do the eyes not soften upon the tile among the whimsical gesture sifted flight? A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. This I've always taken as, the narrator, right? The speaker, having, his or her eyes, softening upon the tile, like watching it as the moth kind of, sits down to the tile. This could also be a reference to the moth, viewing whatever it is it's viewing, right, among the whimsical gesture sifted flight. And that's such a beautiful fucking line, right? Just like we have this kind of insistent kind of, rhythmic set of rhythms here. We have something similar going on, right, among the whimsical gesture sifted flight. What is a gesture sifted flight, right? Just imagine that. And the thing is, you can imagine it, right? When we think of the meaning of the word sift, right? Gesture sifted, right? You could imagine all manner of things. It could be, a speaker watching this and sort of, trying to, maybe either observe this casually. Maybe there's some gestures in the mind, maybe physically, maybe trying to get the moth out, maybe trying to like bring the moth back to like whatever fucking grisly ass experiments are going on these creatures. Or of course it could just be, the gesture sifted flight of the creature itself, right? Like just imagine, like moth wings and, imagine you're able to like slow them down and imagine what that looks like versus how you actually see moth wings, which is going to be much faster than your eye can truly detect, which is why it's a swarm, right? This word here, right, could easily be some kind of reference point back there as well. And whimsical too, right? I mean, we know that this is kind of like if you imagine like a moth, right? It's kind of like insistent, almost like the movements of the moth are whimsical in some way, playful in some way. And then we have the repetition, right? We have the mystery here, and we have the mystery again, sort of being kind of, cemented once more, right? So we don't have any waste thus far, whereas already here we had a little bit of waste in the Bishop poem. Aside a wall, tilted wings, brazen while. Like same thing here. I guess this is a little bit similar to and look, my last or next to last, right? You don't really expect that feminine rhyme. You also don't expect this here, right? Especially like in between, we have hard pause, comma, brazen, right? Which is already like a tough kind of not very sonorous word, comma, while. Again, that shit stops you dead in your tracks. Even if you want to read this pretending like there is no enjambment, you're going to be forced to do a lot of pausing here automatically. So, Jessica is constructing the poem in such a way where you're gonna have to put a pause, like whether or not you personally want to, right? Aside a wall, tilted wings, brazen while nearing investigation. You have no choice. right? While nearing investigation. That's a a clever, very compact way of talking about a site, whether it's the narrator again or somebody or something else, right? Nearing investigation. It's the moth, perhaps, like sitting down something to observe it, to investigate it. Very, very compact, right? And the fact that we have like this kind of difficult line, like to sort of say, and we have the nearing investigation, this thing that you sort of immediately know what it means, and you have the hard pause. I mean, it's very useful, right? There's a lot of technical utility here. A severed site, freeze into moth, substance of the spiral, right? What is this? A severed site. Like if we take it to mean, if we take the grammar to mean the moth was doing the investigation, like what did it just see? Like I said earlier that just knowing that we're in a laboratory, it's already kind of like icky to a lot of people. A moth lost in it. This isn't like very positive language in some senses. Willful sounded plight. We already talked about that. Are we back to this idea of plight, right? A severed site. Right. I mean, in the context of lab and lab equipment, right, a severed site has, again, some of that kind of like fulcrum quality of we're going to keep sort of making this a little more serious. We're going to keep upping the ante. We're going to keep giving it a kind of like, existential kind of quality of a death or living or, some kind of in between. Toward the cosmos, artificial light files between airs shifting flee into flight. I've always found that particularly beautiful. I know that beauty is not the best way to view art, but sometimes beauty can very much be an element of art. And in this case, I think it is, right? Airs shifting flee into flight. I can imagine that there was one time Jessica wrote this novel, Human Stuff, where some dumbfuck shit kicker publisher reading it was asking her about the line. What do you mean in this line by the wild, right? The fact that she used an adjective and a noun like attached to one another. This was like beyond his comprehension. And you have like a similar thing going on. So I could see, a rube of that sort saying, what do you mean by flee into flight? But you know exactly what she fucking means if you spend any kind of time with poetry, right? The shifting flee into flight. Kind of like, imagine like just yourself running, right? A shifting flee into flight. You might just start running, right? Imagine the position that you take, what happens with your shoulders, with your body, right? You're kind of moving this concept of like, okay, I am doing this concept of fleeing. The actual flight itself would be your motion, right? So, let's not be rubes about these interpretations. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles. In landing where the dish room is docile, it commands dashing spans of whispered height, freeze into moth substance of the spiral. So this thing here, which could have been a little bit sinister, perhaps not, here, like it's sort of used in the positive sense, right? It's sitting down docile, but kind of, like you don't expect it commands, right? I mean, if you have a word like docile versus commands, they're almost antonyms in spirit. But we go from the fact, just actually speaking, it's sitting down in docile sense, but it does command something, right? It may not itself be conventionally beautiful, right? It may not itself be powerful. It may very well be like the next victim of whatever fucking experiments they're doing in the lab, right? But here the observer is imbuing it with, meaning. The observer is saying, perhaps this is something that I'm going to write a poem about at some point. Perhaps if we just, forget the observer and just imagine this as like the architecture of a poem, this thing, this event, this image is powerful enough that it commands, right? It commands your attention. Dashing spans of whispered height. So we are kind of propping up this moth, right? We're giving it even kind of, higher and more highfalutin language. So any kind of like sort of negative conceptions, like you almost get like a sense of like a little bit of relief, right? All the kind of, like baby fulcrums that maybe this would have been a little bit darker than we mean. We're sort of like not allowing us to fully go in that direction, right? Which again, it's kind of clever, right? You keep playing with these kinds of expectations again in ways that you don't see the same thing in Bishop's poem. You get a lot of it, right? You get much more of it than you get in the vast majority of Villanelle is published. This is fine. But you get a lot more compactness and layers of meaning here. So, final stanza: textured wings, swift in horizontal style, cross-tethered interiors of light. A beauty circumvents that which beguiles, frees into moth, substance of the spiral. So Dan did this essay a while back, 2001 actually, about this poem. So Jessica had already written, and he was comparing it to this Villanelle by Dylan Thomas, which, like, I mean, just like from the title alone, like, you sort of know that this is kind of, it's not that great. Do not go gentle into that good night. It's a little bit like melodramatic, especially when we know like what that good night is about. Like, we're talking about death. It's kind of a little bit of a trite way to describe death. And then, yeah, of course, super fucking melodrama, rage against the dying of the light. It's a poem that has good qualities as well as like some significant problems. And I just want to have like a little bit of Dan's analysis here because Dan mentioned some things here that I hadn't thought about when I first read this poem. So instead of just like taking his analysis and taking credit for it, let me just read what Dan had to write, since I did not think of this myself. So Dan writes, for those of you that are just hearing this: the first difference vis-a-vis Thomas's poem is Jess's poem's title. It puts us in a precise place and predicament. The very nature of the spoken of protagonist oddly lends the Villanelle power. Think of a moth's very flickering notion. It repeats over and again, yet it is restricted, in this poem, by its location. Unlike Thomas, Jess's imagery and repetons are not familiar, much less cliched. Think of this. In a poem about a moth, the only two mentions of light are just tangential at best to the moth. That's quite a feat. Both repetons are fresh and intriguing. Beauty's kibosh of interest, and the moth's being possibly a verb in some instances, yet nonetheless either verb or noun merely being subordinate to the motion. Wonderful in a poem on a moth. The flickering motion is gesture sifted. The moth possibly becomes air itself and is a shifting fleeance of light. The alliteration and assonance of this poem is supreme. Its music equals or surpasses Thomas's, yet this poem has none of the hackneyed demerits. The whole poem states a very modern posit. Matter is energy. So going back to like what Joel and I were talking about in Artifact, Art and Physics, like you could have like similar ideas, right, being applied to writing, right? With writing, usually it's not going to be just like we're going to presage physics, right? With writing, we get a lot more kind of, day-to-day human stuff, right? We get a lot of shit like we just get a ton of like psychological insight. We get a ton of like relational stuff, historical insights, whatever, right? So these are the ways that writing gets ahead of like roughly speaking the sciences. So Dan continues, yet as concise as E equals MC squared is, it is not as beautiful as this poem. If there's a published strict Villanelle as good as this, I would be delighted to read it. I doubt, however, they will match the originality of this poem, both in conception and execution. And I mean, like 20 years after the fact, this is still true. I mean, I don't know of any like recent good Villanelles. And honestly, like if they do come out, they're probably going to come out of like, something in the cosmoetic orbit of some sort. I'm positive we're going to see tons of eventually very nice Villanelles coming from Joel Parrish. So look out for that. Let me see if there's any comments. So the Newhouse says about the Elizabeth Bishop poem, he calls it forced sentiment, which is, I guess this is kind of like a more concise way of saying some of the things that I was trying to say. there's a lot of like forcing in general, right? I mean, it's a good enough villanelle that it should be studied. If anything, it should be studied for just seeing some of its best parts against some of the kind of more forced stuff. And how can we avoid this? I mean, this is a great example of something that really teaches you what a villanelle could and perhaps like in some ways should not be, right? How easy it is to get lost in this, these repetitions that kind of don't necessarily always go somewhere, or repetitions that do kind of just force themselves through as opposed to actually being something, on their own.